Finally, Bobby Kotick left the Activision Blizzard company and the studio passed into the reliable hands of Microsoft. They will certainly find a new president of the Activision Blizzard, but in any case, Blizzard chairman Mike Ibarra will most likely have more freedom. Now, all the hardships in the company will end. Blizzard will return to stability and start releasing new games. Well, maybe not exactly.
Bruh.
However, let's start this story from the beginning.
Oh, welcome! Come warm your frozen boots by the fire.
Surely there are the most pleasant words you can hear after a hard day's work. Blizzard Entertainment is associated with the atmosphere of the family circle, the smell of ale in the pub, and pleasant childhood memories. Now, rather only avid fans have these feelings, those who found the golden days of Blizzard and grew up with them. For most gamers, Blizzard evokes complete opposite emotions. Some have already buried this studio, while others simply criticize its every step. But is this really the case? Is the titan of the gaming industry dead, or is this just a bad time in the life of Blizzard Entertainment, which will soon turn into a lucky one? BlizzCon 2023 has shed light on the future of the studio, which has been in crisis for the last 7 years. But is this the bright future that everyone expects? Today in our video, we'll try to find answers to how Blizzard Entertainment Studio was born, climbed Olympus, and scorched its wings in the sun. What role did the infamous Bobby Kotick play in this, and most importantly, will the Titan still straighten his shoulders? You're watching PressX. Sit down closer to the fireplace, make sure that the Murlocs don't steal your boots, and we're starting. It was 1991. The Soviet Union collapsed, the Berlin Wall fell, and the United States launched Operation Desert Storm. The world of the game industry was already boiling with gaming innovations, the development of computer technology, consoles, and the like. In general, the 80s and 90s became crucial in the development of the industry thanks to ordinary amateurs, experimenters, and enthusiasts. For example, Jordan Mechner is known for his innovative approach to computer animation in the first Prince of Persia, and the legendary Lemmings from DMA Design just blew up the industry. However, they were already more or less made in the studio, but not at home. Speaking of the history of the Prince of Persia and DMA Design, we have separate videos on the channel. If you're interested in where DMA Design started in order to come to Lemmings and GTA, we advise you to subscribe to our channel. So, using the example of these successful startups, which started with one PC, which was in the parents' room, and the desire to make games, Alain Adam, the future CEO of Blizzard, decides not to miss his chance either. Alain's been playing video games since a very young age. His first game was the arcade one, Pong. At the age of 14, when his parents gave him his first computer, he began writing code and creating his own games. And in order to do it professionally, he went to study electrical engineering at the university. In 1991, Alain graduated from the University of California, and along with a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, he received $10,000 from his parents for a trip with friends to Europe. However, instead of spending all the money on joy, Alain came up with another idea. So on February 8, 1991, together with his fellow students Frank Pierce and Mike Morheim, he founded a new game studio which was named Silicon and Synapse in Costa Mesa, California. You're probably thinking, what is this? Silicon and Synapse? Well, let's talk about everything in order. In general, the friendship story of these three young men is very interesting and fortuitous, so we will stay here for a while. Alain Adam and Michael Morheim attended the same lectures at the end of their studies, but at one of the lectures, Michael saw Alain step away from the computer for a minute and decided to make a joke, quickly changing the password of his device to Joe. Unsuspectingly, Adam returned, entered his password, and logged in again. Morheim was stunned. By a complete coincidence, Joe was Adam's first password, and without even realizing that the password had been changed, he successfully entered it. Basically, after Michael admitted to Adam what he had done, they became friends. With Frank Pierce, they skipped seminars on artificial intelligence. Instead, they spent time at the University Computer Club where they played games together. Since then, the three have become close friends, and it's thanks to this that the future Silicon and Synapse appeared. Do you understand what kind of company this is?
I've pretty much since Apple II's existed been interested in playing games. So since I was a kid, I've known that either I wanted to run a candy factory, because Willy Wonka was my favorite movie growing up, or run a game shop. So that was sort of the inception of the idea. I had no idea that this was all going to turn into Blizzard.
The name of Silicon and Synapse came to Adam's mind almost immediately. Silicon is certainly not something that is inserted into the breast, but the material from which processors are made, and synapses are important elements of our brain. Adam became president of the company, Morheim became vice president, and Pierce became chief programmer. But Adam did not want to stop on 3 people. Therefore, it was decided to recruit exactly the same computer game fans as them to the Silicon and Synapse team. It was then, according to an announcement in the newspaper, quote, "An artist designer is needed in the game development studio." They were joined by graphic artist and comic book fan Sam Dieter, who became the main artist of the Warcraft, Starcraft, and Diablo projects in the future. And then the legendary Bob Fitch joined in.
I walk in my I Love Toxic Waste t-shirt with a Tasmanian devil on the front, shorts and a t-shirt, sandals, and apparently it struck a chord with the 3 guys there.
This seemingly strange man was a wild fan of D&D and everything related to it, and combined with his programming expertise, the company has received a technical director for all upcoming Blizzard games. In total, Silicon and Synapse recruited 12 geeks, computer game and comic book fanatics. There was, for example, Stu Rose among them. He is one of the first artists of the company who created the logo for Silicon and Synapse, and then the original Blizzard logo, which is still used today. The first office of the company was very cramped. It was only 592 square feet. For the first 2 years of its existence, the company mainly worked as a cheap coding force. The developers have been porting games for the Amiga and Commodore 64, including such successful titles as J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings Volume 1, Castles, and Micro League Baseball. The work fees were barely enough to pay the salaries of the employees on time. Therefore, the team used a clever scheme. Alan went to the nearest store, bought the product with a credit card, and then returned it and received cash for it. This trick allowed employees to pay their salary without delay for a while. However, despite all the financial difficulties, the desire to create something of their own did not leave them. So, in 1991, with the help of publisher Interplay Entertainment Corp., which was interested in developing talented game creators, Silicon and Synapse were able to make their first game called RPM Racing. RPM Racing is a successful remake of an 8-bit video game on the Commodore 64, Racing Destruction Set from Electronic Arts. Silicon and Synapse made a 16-bit RPM Racing, which already in the year of the company's foundation received really good critical acclaim, and most importantly, brought the company its first audience and recognition. RPM Racing was developed in 4 months. It was a regular race. The gameplay was minimal. There were 3 modes: seasonal races, a series of races, a single race, and something like creativity in Minecraft where the player could create his own track. The tracks could be straight and oval, winding and hilly, or there was an unpredictable tracks mode in general where various tracks were generated randomly. For winning races, the player received money that he could spend in the in-game store. It was possible to pump elements of your car in it, but this was not the main feature of the game.
We were, I think, the first American developer to develop and release a title for the Super Famicom, and we literally were using untranslated Japanese documents.
RPM is one of the first games for the SNES to develop a high-resolution graphics display mode that allows you to draw details more clearly, but with fewer colors. However, this was limited by the SNES video memory limit, but it was for this graphics that it gained its popularity. Of course, today the game does not look so spectacular, but in those days when all modern graphic systems were just being developed, RPM was something unique. After RPM Racing, Silicon and Synapse did not stop and worked on 2 products at once for the next few years. Rock and Roll Racing was the first to appear on the shelves of gaming stores in 1993. In essence, it was still the same race, but with a few important differences. The fact is that in the game, you could not only drive different cars, but also attack your opponents with different weapons. The developers added aliens, spaceships, and all sorts of laser barrels to the game, which were not available in RPM Racing. And for those who did not want to fight with opponents, nitro boosters were available. They allowed you to break away from dangerous opponents. Speaking of opponents, now the game has a simple plot. There were 4 drivers, including one from the human race, who we play for, and we faced 2 aliens, Rip and Shred, and 1 unique character for each new location. In addition, Rock and Roll Racing became famous for its soundtrack. Due to the fact that Silicon and Synapse found a company that could get cheap licensed tracks, players in Rock and Roll Racing could race to the songs of Deep Purple, Black Sabbath, and Judas Priest. What kind of races can there be without cool music? The icing on the cake was multiplayer, which had rarely happened in other games of '93 before. Thus, Silicon and Synapse managed to make a small revolution in the gaming industry, for which their second project quite naturally received the title of Best Racing Game of the Year from Video Game Magazine. But that was just the beginning. After all, in the same 93rd year, the second game from Silicon and Synapse, called The Lost Vikings, appeared on the shelves.
So the first SNES title that I worked on in earnest was Lost Vikings, and we had almost everyone in the office working on that project.
At the beginning of the development of The Lost Vikings, the entire team started without him, was inspired by the world-famous game Lemmings from DMA. After all, Lemmings, at that time, was a breakthrough in the genre of puzzle games, and almost everyone played it. So after deciding why not make their own puzzle game, Silicon and Synapse started developing the idea. At the start, the project looked like Lemmings, but instead of little men with green hair, the game had 50 Vikings dragging ladders, throwing torches, and so on. However, such a large number of Vikings looked strange, and the developers began to reduce the number of game units. Thus, 3 out of 50 Vikings remained in the game, from which the plot was born. The plot of The Lost Vikings told about 3 Vikings who were sucked into a spaceship by an evil Tomater, the emperor of the alien Croutonian Empire, to fill an intergalactic zoo. Fleeing from the ship, 3 Vikings were lost in different time periods, and to find their way home, they were able to overcome various bizarre locations, and with others, defeat Tomater. Ordinary platformer. This was exactly the wording you might hear about this project years later. However, Silicon and Synapse has made a small revolution once again. In The Lost Vikings, there was no specific main character. You played for all 3 Vikings at the same time, because each of them had its own characteristics, without which it was impossible to pass any location of the game or puzzle, just as it was impossible to pass a level if at least one of the Vikings died in the process of passing. So Eric, or Eric the Swift, the lowest among the Vikings, was the main mobile force of the team because he ran the fastest and jumped the highest of all. Olaf, the Stout, was armed with a shield that could not be penetrated, and at some points in the game, Olaf could raise the shield above his head and transform into a platform that the other 2 Vikings could use to jump. In addition, he could fly, or rather soar, raising the shield above his head and descending from the edge of the platform. The last, 3rd Viking, Baliog the Fierce, was armed with a sword and bow which could kill enemy mobs and thereby protect Vikings from death. Interestingly, these characters could be played both independently and in the company of friends. And the most interesting thing is that the development team created the world's first project that contained an adequately working local cooperative for 3 people. Michael Morheim recalls.
This was my first project at Blizzard. It was a C++ project written completely in Zortex C++, and learned how to program in C++.
Another feature of the game was the design. Probably it was then that Silicon and Synapse found its own standard of visual quality. The Viking design was cartoon-like, which would later become Blizzard's hallmark. Not surprisingly, The Lost Vikings was nominated in the Best Design category by Nintendo Power. And in the same year that Rock 'n' Roll Racing was awarded Best Racing Game of the Year, Vikings won the Best Puzzle Game of the Year award from IGN. How do you like this launch of a company that was formed only 2 years ago? It was truly a celebration for the entire Silicon and Synapse team. The Lost Vikings was a special project because it was the first game of the company which had their own completely original script, title, idea, and design. The game became an icon of the company's early creativity, and in 1995 its sequel was released. However, after such an important success, a miracle did not happen, and golden mountains did not fall on the company. After all, neither the stylistic design of games nor their awards did not bring the developers the expected result, earnings. But they had a big financial problem. The fact was that already at that time, the studio had a rather bloated staff, and it was quite difficult to provide them. There was only one way out of this situation: to move the development of new projects to the background and return to the main business, porting games. The games were published by the previously mentioned Interplay Entertainment Company, which was interested in luring away talented developers. But the company that made educational games and apps, Davidson and Associates, was ahead and previously acquired Silicon and Synapse for $10 million. Silicon and Synapse calmly agreed to this because having a large wallet with an endless budget for game development was a lifeline for the company. But before making the deal, Silicon and Synapse were given 2 conditions. The first was to change the name. Silicon and Synapse was not associated with technology in people, but was associated with female breasts. At first glance, this was not a very bad association, but only at first glance, and none of the businessmen they dealt with knew what Synapse was.
Think about it. You're dealing with numbers all day long. Decimal points, high frequencies, bang, bang, bang. Fucking digits.
Throughout the company's existence, its name has confused people, and the young company shouldn't have done that. So, they rebranded themselves, taking the name under which they wanted to become known forever. It was Chaos Studios. As it turned out, a studio with a similar name already existed and was called Chaos Technologies. Therefore, Chaos Technologies demanded from Silicon and Synapse $100,000 for the right to keep the new name without trial. For Silicon and Synapse, the amount was unaffordable. The developers changed their name to Ogre Studios, but now the owners, Davidson and Associates, have already intervened. The company did not like the name Ogre and asked the developers to find a more accurate word that would not put any labels on the company, because ogres were associated with something cruel, bloody, big and green. Well, you understand. No one else had any ideas for the name, so Alan took up an explanatory dictionary. He began to scour it from the first page, and on the letter B, he found what he thought was a good one. It was the word Blizzard. It's under this name that the word soon recognized the titan of the game industry.
We're a new company with a new name. A company that our clients can believe in. A company that our clients can trust.
The second condition before signing the agreement was that Davidson and Associates would not interfere ideologically and take over Blizzard's project management as long as they were profitable and there were no problems with them. Probably any young gaming company could only dream of such conditions. After signing an agreement with Davidson and Associates, Blizzard has been launching a pipeline for the production and port of games since 1994. It was then that the future game designer and artist, as well as the voice of many key characters in Blizzard games, Christopher Metzen, joined the company. He remembered how he got into the team.
I was playing with a band many years ago, and at one of the gigs we were doing, I guess I was drawing on a cocktail napkin or something. A friend of a friend came by and saw it and said, hey, there's this place down in Costa Mesa hiring for artists. And I didn't really know what the place was. I thought it was like some kind of graphic arts firm. But at the time I figured, hey, if they're going to pay me to draw, that sounds pretty good. And I rolled down on a Friday morning and met a very charming man called Joey Ray. I think his first words out of his mouth were, what the hell do you want?
Metzen immediately found himself in a company that worked in manufacturing hell. In general, at that time, Blizzard produced decent games that brought the company good money and reputation. For example, Blackthorn was a game that was very similar to the Prince of Persia, but with killing orcs with firearms, due to a hero with long hair. The fact was that the main artist of Blackthorn, Sam Dieter, had long hair, and when creating the character, the game developers used the same rotoscopy technology that Jordan Mechner used to create the original Prince of Persia. Or, there was another game in the genre of beat them all, The Death and Return of Superman, which Blizzard ported for the SNES by order of the Japanese company Sunsoft. The main thing was that in November 94, a game was released that launched the first and main series of Blizzard games. The project that the company is primarily associated with even today is the legendary Warcraft series. The developers drew inspiration for the company's most famous game franchise from the equally famous game called Dune 2 in 1992 by the French studio Cryo Interactive. The main plot was based on Frank Herbert's novel Dune, and the inspiration for creating the game was fueled by the recently released David Lynch film of the same name. In those days, the science fiction genre was at its peak, so creating something based on space with aliens was a trend. But the main thing that Blizzard caught on in Dune 2 was the gameplay. The game consisted of two intertwined layers of gameplay: an adventure layer that resembles dungeon crawler games, and a top-view strategy layer that's more like 4X games. X for explore, expand, exploit, exterminate. Blizzard decided that online and real-time strategies are the future of the gaming world. However, just copying Dune was not interesting and no one needed it. Therefore, the first step was to move the setting of the future game from science fiction to fantasy. The basis of the setting was inspired by the Warhammer universe, and at some point in development, the game was supposed to be released specifically about Warhammer. But Adam did not manage to agree on a license with the copyright holder of the Warhammer franchise. And thank God. The idea was changed. The main conflict of the game was based on the confrontation between orcs and humans in the fantasy world, and this is what determined the full name of the future game: Warcraft, Orcs and Humans. Sam Dieter recalled,
That was our attempt at doing something that was a little bit more fun and fast and fantasy, but not boring medieval fantasy with little doinky swords and guys with little chainmail hoods. Nah, we had cool stuff like orcs with horns coming out of the sides of their helmet and all kinds of teeth and dwarves and all that.
It was the work of the main artists that set the main tone for the future Warcraft, and the plot of the game was also born from the visual content. The story of the world of Warcraft begins with the fact that Egwene, the all-powerful sorceress, the only defender of the world of people, realized that it was time for her to die and found a successor, Medivh. But Medivh began to study dark magic and thereby build up his power. While doing this, he found the world of Draenor inhabited by orcs and contacted their sorcerer, Gul'dan. They made an agreement according to which the Medivh will create a portal to the human world and after the defeat of Azeroth, will rule both worlds. And Gul'dan told about the location of the Tomb of Sargeras, which holds ancient secrets and great power. After Medivh and Gul'dan opened the portals, difficult times began in the world of Azeroth. From this moment on, the great battle for Azeroth, the events of the game, and the entire universe began. However, in fact, the plot of the future game existed only in single player. Warcraft, Orcs, and Humans offered two linear plots as part of their respective campaigns, Humans and Orcs. They were a story sequence of separate scenarios, each of which the player must complete in order to proceed to the next one. Blizzard's next step was to rethink the gameplay. The gameplay in Dune unfolded around a base and improving it, and in the first part of Warcraft, Orcs, and Humans, the main focus was shifted towards battles. Another reason for the success of the product was the high balance of both races that existed in the game. Both Orcs and Humans had an equal number of battle characters at their disposal. Even special skills were balanced. For example, humans could heal fellow humans while orcs could turn fallen in battle, both humans and orcs, into skeletons and use them as combat units. Or humans made friendly units invisible and orcs gave their own temporary armor. One of the most important elements of the game's development was the fog of war. By the way, in the first Warcraft, it was called Black Fog. At the beginning of the battle, the minimap was hidden from both players, and after a single visit, the area became visible and the player saw all the events taking place in it. But the most important difference from Dune was Blizzard's implementation of multiplayer mode between players, since artificial intelligence in strategy games was weak at that time. And the feeling of fighting with another real player, the fog of war, tactical and strategic decisions of the enemy in real time made the gameplay extremely exciting. Therefore, it was absolutely necessary to achieve this goal, which was what Patrick Wyatt, Bob Fitch, and Michael Morheim did. Since such a stable and fast online connection did not yet exist in the world, transmitting the entire state of game data in real time was a very complex process. Everything came down to a very large, out-of-sync of actions that were displayed on the player monitors, and it was almost impossible to play real-time strategy like this. Therefore, a team of programmers optimized the Warcraft Orcs and Humans engine for online games in 5 months. They actually created a revolution in local network gaming. In addition, cinematics in the studio's games deserve special attention for their quality. Blizzard was the first company in the entire gaming industry to make the most of cinematography and cinematic quality in its games, and the company is guided by this ideology to this day. Just look at this.
I am not that person anymore. I have no light. Not after what I've seen. Not after what I've done.
Warcraft Orcs and Humans was released on November 23, 1994, captured all possible markets, and topped almost all known ratings. In 1996, Computer Gaming World ranked Warcraft Orcs and Humans 8th in its top of the most sensational games of all time, commenting, quote, "Few people now remember that before this blockbuster, Blizzard was a small and risky adventure." The adventure really turned into something more, and this applies not only to the innovation of Blizzard games. The company and the product they released really became what they wanted to achieve for the developers themselves. Warcraft Orcs and Humans was the game that made Blizzard a very famous and reputable studio, and now all the players were waiting for the sequel. It appeared the following year. Warcraft II: Tides of Darkness was released in the world already in 1995. Compared to the previous part, Warcraft Orcs and Humans, the gameplay of Warcraft 2 has undergone very cool changes. The terrain has become more diverse. The game has added relief. The sea and mountains were added. A new resource, oil, extracted at sea and used for marine units and their technological improvement, has been featured. Battles began to take place not only on land but also in the sea and air. At the same time, units, depending on their type, received attack abilities in these areas. There were new quests and the ability to manage 9 units simultaneously. In the first Warcraft, the player could only control 4 units, which slightly limited the range of its capabilities. The developers have introduced a gray fog of war, when the players could only see current events in areas that are visible to friendly units. They improved the game's economy, added new buildings, and updated the magic system. And they also expanded the possibilities of online play from 2 to 8 players and improved artificial intelligence. But the main thing was that Blizzard has also added a level editor to the list. This will be a very important step for the entire history of games, but more on that later.
Of course, fight.
Blizzard's biggest treasure was the improvement of the multiplayer mode. After the release of the second part of Warcraft, players were able to deploy battles between orcs and humans not only over a local network, but also thanks to the internet. Everyone actively used such a program as Kali. It was the presence of this program and the realization that online battles are the future that soon Blizzard prompted to create its own platform, which today is known to us as Battle.net. And yes, it was a revolution again. The release of Warcraft 2 had an even stronger impact on Blizzard because it was from this moment that not only significant finances, but also huge fan resources began to concentrate in their hands. Along with the growth of profits, the company continued to expand its staff, and when hiring people, it also focused on initiative and the desire to create the future of the gaming industry. In January 1995, Blizzard received an unexpected phone call. It was a call from David Brevik, the director of the small American studio Condor, which had previously developed only one game about American football. They were working on a new game with their own original idea and were looking for a publisher. Condor turned to all the major publishers and then to several small ones, but they all refused them. The fact was that Condor wanted to create a turn-based role-playing game in the action genre with an epic story and plasticine animation. So as you understand, this is exactly the suggestion that, according to Adam, they contacted Blizzard.
We said, well, we think the core of the idea is excellent, but let us show you what we're doing with 3D these days. And so we kind of redirected them from claymation to 3D. Let's try to imagine what Diablo would have looked like if it were done with claymation.
Blizzard agreed and signed a contract with the lucky developer, who was the first studio to be released through their mediation. However, later in 1996, the owners of Blizzard, Davidson and Associates, acquired Condor, and the studio was renamed. So, a subsidiary division was born. It was named Blizzard North, and it managed to make another gaming revolution. The fact was that among Blizzard's employees, there were quite a lot of fans of the Dungeons & Dragons series of board games, and they were not just fans, but real geeks. The success of D&D is quite hard to deny, because the game first appeared on the shelves in 1974, and it still manages to capture the attention of thousands of people around the world.
What I wouldn't give to just a dragon right now.
Therefore, it is clear that the idea of creating D&D in a virtual 3D universe was brilliant. Despite the fact that many games already existed in a similar universe with dungeon exploration mechanics and slaughters with monsters. But due to the fact that the D&D universe was much more thoughtful and flexible, the new division of Blizzard North decided to create a video game project in the D&D setting. This project becomes Diablo. One of the main goals that Blizzard North wanted to achieve in Diablo was the simplicity of the game. After all, the D&D rules made players create a character, answer 53 questions about your character choose its properties, subclasses, and invent a backstory. For a video game, all this was not necessary. Brevik also wanted the characters in the game to be combinations of typical character classes so that players wouldn't be overly limited in what types of attacks or armors they could use as they progressed. A further departure from roguelike games was to expand the loot system from slain monsters, and there was a modern and cool interface in the plans, which was supposed to provide fast availability and, most importantly, convenience of the game, like in Doom of 1993. These plans and ideas did not raise any questions from Blizzard's head office, but in addition to David Brevik's ideas, the office insisted that Diablo be a turn-based game with the ability to roll dice that would determine the success of certain actions. Hello, Baldur's Gate 3. In addition to this, Blizzard North wanted to abandon the multiplayer mode in the game. Blizzard's head office was against it. After all, losing the ability to release more games with the online gaming option would be a critical mistake. And as for the dice placement mechanics, they were also against it because this slowed down the pace of the game and turned Diablo into a mortal bore. Therefore, under pressure from Blizzard's head office, Blizzard North changed the concept and gameplay of the game, and on January 3, 1997, the legendary Diablo was born. According to the plot, Diablo was incredibly interesting. Players find themselves in a universe divided into the world of mortal men, sanctuary, paradise, and burning hell. After centuries of war between angels and demons, the three lords of hell, Mephisto, Baal, and Diablo, decided to achieve victory over the angels through their influence on the mortal world. They wreaked havoc, hatred, and distrust in Sanctuary until a group of mages led by the supreme mage Horadrim imprisoned the lords of hell in crystals called soul stones. One of these stones, with the prisoner Diablo, was buried deep in the catacombs underground, over which a monastery was later built. Many years passed, the monastery collapsed, and later the town of Tristram was built in its place. And on the site where the soul stone from Diablo was buried, the king of this town, Leoric, built a cathedral. Because of this, Diablo began to manipulate Leoric, and he began to go crazy, and the whole city was cursed. The game itself begins with the fact that our hero comes to the city, and it all started. The player had three typical D&D classes to choose from: warrior, rogue, and sorcerer. Each class had a different level of basic attributes along with a unique skill. A warrior is a melee fighter and has the most health, armor index, and of course strength. Rogue is a master of ranged weapons. It's very effective at attacking enemies from a distance with a bow, although not as strong as a warrior. And the sorcerer was characterized by the lowest health score, but had many spells with high damage in his arsenal. In fact, there was no need for more. We are already savvy players who are used to a million buttons that need to be pressed simultaneously. And then in 1997, it was revolutionary, especially since Diablo had a multiplayer mode thanks to Battle.net, which allowed players to play 4 at the same time, with the ability to kill each other or pass the catacombs together on the way to hell.
Oh, that's good of you. Oh, hey, it's a unique skeleton named Skullfire.
Yes, it's not that one unique skeleton.
As a result, even at the production stage, the game received as many as 450,000 pre-orders, and after its release, it managed to take first place in the list of sales for a long 3 months. Worldwide sales of the game exceeded 500,000 copies in 4 months from release date, 750,000 in 6 months in June, and 1 million copies by the end of November. By the end of 1997, Diablo had sold 670,155 copies in the United States alone. And although Diablo and Warcraft were a success for the company in general, 1997 turned out to be a terrible year. CompUcard Corporation began to absorb and buy up large companies in the gaming industry with the motivation to create the largest developer and publisher of computer games. Their victims were supposed to be Sierra, LucasArts Entertainment, Broderbund, and Davidson and Associates, the owner of Blizzard Entertainment. CUC announced the imminent acquisition of Sierra and Davidson and Associates for $1.06 and $1.14 billion respectively. But the acquisition of LucasArts and Broderbund did not take place. Later, it turns out that the CUC company kept fake accounting records for several years and was actually engaged in laundering illegal money. In addition, it is widely known as one of the largest representatives of the hotel business and car rental throughout America. Due to the scandal and legal proceedings, the corporation's shares plummeted and depreciated. Sierra and Blizzard were on the verge of bankruptcy. Therefore, both companies went under the hammer for pennies in favor of the large media publishing house Havas, and it, in turn, passed into the hands of Vivendi Games, part of the Vivendi conglomerate. Remember this company. We'll meet this name again today. Against the background of all these perturbations, Blizzard managed to systemically release games. In times of crisis, the Lost Vikings sequel was released in a space setting that did not hit the jackpot, and in general, few people knew about its existence. Although this is not surprising because the other two franchises of developers just thundered on the shelves of stores. However, two franchises were not enough to get out of the crisis. Therefore, without wasting time, Blizzard plans to make the next game. As Metzen recalled,
geek amongst us, didn't grow up wanting to work on Star Wars. So Starcraft was an opportunity to, dig out a different kind of space opera.
The idea of developing the future of Starcraft began with simply transferring a ready-made game in the form of Warcraft 2 to a space setting. After all, the RTS game mechanism that Blizzard came up with worked like clockwork, so why not use it again? Orcs in Space was the working title of the project, but the plot of Warcraft in the new game was simply impossible to transfer. Therefore, during collective brainstorming and simple sketching of ideas, the first Zerg and Protoss appeared. The cinematic department was the first to start working. At that time, the developers did not even have a written plot or a legend of everything that would happen in the game, but the cinematics were already ready. Because of this, they all seem very detached from the events of the game. But despite this, it was cinematics that were the main source of inspiration for development. After developing the first demo version of StarCraft, Blizzard took it to E3, waiting for everything to go well and their new game to take off like Warcraft and Diablo. But this didn't happen. The number of visitors to their booth was minimal, which was unusual for the company at that time. The RTS genre had already changed by that time. The graphics and gameplay of Warcraft was outdated, and the games of the Command & Conquer series were already considered hits, especially the second part named Red Alert. There was the first major failure of the studio. Therefore, immediately after the exhibition, realizing that Warcraft in Space will not work and this will have a bad effect on the company's reputation, Blizzard activated their creative potential to the maximum. One of the first stages of a complete redesign of the future StarCraft was the creation of a completely new game engine. Bob Fitch, who actually lived in his office for 3 months, wrote a completely new game engine. It allowed them to add pre-rendered sprites and backgrounds created using Autodesk 3D's Max to the game, make the in-game view isometric, and add new features to the game. For example, some units could disguise themselves and burrow into the ground. By the way, Bob still had a son at that time. These were his only 18 hours of rest for the next 8 months. This is how absolutely everyone in the team works. Crunches in the video game industry even today are a problem that everyone's trying to overcome. But then they were generally considered the norm. Alain Adam recalled,
Every day for a month leading up to December, I said, at midnight to all 50 of us who were still there working 7 days a week, don't worry, we're in the home stretch. Of course, we were nowhere near the home stretch.
But all the hellish work was worth it. Officially, StarCraft was released almost a year later than planned, on March 31st, 1998. The plot of the game tells about the war of 3 races: Terrans, essentially humans, Zerg, space beetles, and Protoss, an advanced ancient race. Conflicts between these 3 races for one reason or another occurred in the game all the time, but today we're more interested in the gameplay. So let's move on to it. StarCraft was one of the first real-time strategy games in which each race played by the player differs not only in appearance, but also in the characteristics of its representatives, as well as in the overall battle strategy. The Protoss have powerful but expensive warriors and equipment at their disposal. The Zerg surpass the enemy in numbers and speed. Terrans, on the other hand, are in the middle in terms of value and power, balancing between Zerg and Protoss. The usual balance of units and buildings from Warcraft simply disappeared, and the number of variations of the game increased significantly. Blizzard also made a cool map editor, Star Edit, where players could create their own maps, create their own sprite models, buildings, and much more. However, the most successful aspect of the game was multiplayer. It turned out to be so balanced and exciting that the game marked the beginning of a professional esports scene within a few months of its release. It was another gaming revolution from Blizzard. The number of awards received by the game exceeded Warcraft and Diablo's indicators. StarCraft got such awards as the greatest game of all time by GameSpot magazine, best-selling PC game of 1998 by PC Data, and 5 awards, Game of the Year. And that's not even a third of the entire list. StarCraft turned out to be so cool that in less a year it managed to gain a cult status in Korea. This, in turn, gave a big boost to the development of the esports scene in this country. It also marked the beginning of the opening of esports schools in Asia. Thus, Blizzard actually saved themselves from the first, but not the last, crisis situation. After 3 legendary franchises, Warcraft, Diablo, and Starcraft, Blizzard entered the world stage of the game industry. We can say that a small company with ambitions changed the course of the whole story. After all, if not for these geeks, comic book fans, and rock and rollers, the world of computer games would not soon have moved to such a scale as with the help of Blizzard. Trying to maintain the status of a leader in RTS games, Blizzard begins to create and release add-ons and sequels to their already well-known games. Thus, the studio tried to maintain a monopoly on the genre. After the successful release of the Warcraft 2 in 1995, Blizzard planned to focus on developing Starcraft. Therefore, they signed a contract to develop an add-on for Warcraft 2 with Cyberlore Studios outsourcing development. But after one of the stages, Blizzard called the Warcraft 2 Beyond the Dark Portal project from Cyberlore as of poor quality and canceled its contract, independently completing the add-on package and releasing it in 1996. The add-on of Warcraft 2 Beyond the Dark Portal has added 2 new campaigns and several new maps to the game. There were also new swamp locations for the world of Draenor. The biggest difference from the original Warcraft 2 was the presence of a large number of new heroes and the ability to control them. The new campaign featured 10 new heroes, 5 for the Alliance and 5 for the Horde. In addition, Warcraft Adventures: Lord of the Clans was planned to be released in the same 1996 year, which was supposed to become a graphic quest. In those years, this genre was quite popular. Another partner studio, Capital Multimedia, offered Blizzard to make Quest. The companies acquired Animation Magic, a subsidiary of Capital Multimedia. Blizzard was also engaged in game design and project management. The game took place in the world of Azeroth and began shortly after the events of Warcraft 2. The main character was the orc Thaw, who was raised and trained by Aedelis Blackmore. He wanted to grow a gladiator out of Thaw, but everything did not go according to plan. The plot of the game was to unite the tribes of orcs who lost the war and lived on reservations under the rule of humans. The game's mechanics are typical point-and-click interfaces with finding all sorts of items, solving puzzles, exploring the world, and interacting with others. The game was planned to be released in 1997, but development was delayed. It was affected by the lack of experience of Capital Multimedia in games of this genre. In February 1998, Blizzard hired game designer Steve Meretzky to finish the game. The project was almost ready for completion, but financial and time constraints did not allow for a full redesign of the game. Therefore, all of Meretzky's developments remained unused. Therefore, after 18 months of development, Blizzard canceled the game due to its non-compliance with the company's quality standards. The script of the game was reworked into the novel Lord of the Clans by Christie Golden. It became canon, and some elements of the game influenced World of Warcraft and the upcoming film. We'll talk about it separately a little later. The game itself was considered forgotten for a long time, but in the 2010s, someone leaked a video of the gameplay of Warcraft Adventures to the internet, and in September 2016, an unofficial working version of the game hit the net, which someone put in order. The game even had voice acting.
It would take a lot of force to make it work. This thing looks like it could do some damage.
Consequently, the experience that Blizzard gained from unreliable third-party companies prompted them to give preference to internal development of future add-ons for games. All future Blizzard games and add-ons were presented in Battle.net, which was used to host multiplayer games and search for players. This quickly became a significant part of the company's success as their games expanded online communities to an incredible scale. As a result, Blizzard re-released Warcraft 2 in 1999 with a set that included an add-on Beyond the Dark Portal called Warcraft 2 Battle.net Edition. That was actually the same game, but with improved graphics and better artificial intelligence. In parallel with these events with Warcraft and the release of Starcraft, Blizzard North Studio did not stand still. After the triumphant Diablo, it announced the release of Diablo 2. The game once again broke all sales records. Diablo 2 became, by that time, the best-selling product in the history of computer games. 2 million copies sold in 6 months. Diablo 2 was an example of a perfect sequel, where the main essence and general elements did not change in any way, but were improved and refined. The new game not only expanded the already interesting plot, but also added a lot of new characters. There were a lot more items with unique effects, so interesting builds began to be formed. New mechanics that just complemented the simple first part and did not overload. At the same time, the player was asked to not visit several floors of the monastery, but a huge number of detailed locations outside the city. Even PvP in Diablo 2 did pretty well. The only thing left of the old one is Diablo himself as the main antagonist, but that was nothing. The most important advantage was the fully working multiplayer gameplay thanks to Battle.net. This allowed Blizzard to start truly basking in money and fame. It was after Diablo 2 that Blizzard planned a sequel to one of its most important games. The development of the legendary Warcraft 3 has begun. Chris Metzen recalled,
Around the time that we started jamming Warcraft 2, I remember feeling very intensely that, like, wouldn't it be fun to blow this thing out, really, to have multiple kingdoms and continents and, more races involved, each with their own kind of distinct flavor and history. Ultimately, there were many years between, Warcraft 2 and Warcraft 3. We had cut our teeth on a few other, game types or universes that allowed us to grow and really get our, storytelling values in line. So by the time Warcraft 3 really came about, we were ready to attack that thing. We knew who we were as artists. We knew who we were as storytellers. And the ideas came much freer and much clearer. And it definitely had heart.
For 3 years, players and fans of the series have been waiting for the continuation of the series, and their expectations came true. Warcraft 3 Reign of Chaos was released in 2002 and was completely moved to a three-dimensional graphic space. The graphics in the game even looked good today. In addition, the developers have increased the number of races. In addition to the already famous humans and orcs, players now have the opportunity to play as undead and night elves. At the same time, the overall gameplay has changed. The player also needed to extract resources, rebuild and improve bases, and hire troops in order to destroy the enemy army. But RPG elements have appeared in the game. The main focus in the story campaign shifted from building a base to heroes and leveling them up. There were unique units that had special abilities and gained experience for killing enemy soldiers. In general, the development of Warcraft 3 and the future World of Warcraft went almost parallel, in the sense that while the developers were making Warcraft 3, they tried it on and thought about what it might look like in an RPG plane. Because of this, the first tests of Warcraft 3 were somewhat similar to Diablo in the Warcraft setting, but this idea was abandoned because the main task was to create a cool RTS game and not some kind of semi-RPG. Due to time constraints, we will not be able to tell you the whole story of the Warcraft series, so if you're interested in a detailed story of the legendary Warcraft and WoW, write in the comments, Loktar Ogar, and we'll see how many people want to dive deeper into the universe of Warcraft. Without deviating from traditions, Blizzard made one of the best cinematics of the time for the game, which fans simply adored and watched instead of TV shows in the evenings. Of course, Warcraft 3 has become an esports discipline, just like Starcraft, but in the beginning, these were not the cyber arenas that exist now. Due to its cool balance and lack of randomness in games, the main aspect of winning Warcraft or Starcraft was skill. It is not surprising that over time, regular competitions in the skill will have viewers, sponsors, and prize pools. People started making money with games. That's how the foundations of esports were laid. Sales of Warcraft 3 took a new record. There were 4.5 million pre-orders alone, and the addition of Warcraft 3 The Frozen Throne in 2003 only consolidated the success of the original, conquering an even greater peak. Development of the add-on began in October 2002, shortly after the original game was released. At the same time, the developers were so concerned about the quality of the future add-on that they carefully studied how players use certain races and units in order to understand what kind of improvement and strengthening a particular element needs. One of the key developers of the add-on said that the game will have a new race, the Nagas, but the studio did not include Naga in the final version of the add-on. In addition, shortly before the release of Warcraft 3 The Frozen Throne on April 1st, 2003, Blizzard hinted that the fifth race in the game will be the Pandarans. The studio even created an article on its official internet page with a detailed description of the heroes, units, and their lore. As it turned out, it was an April Fool's joke. In addition, only the neutral hero Pandaran Brewmaster appeared. Well, Blizzard's sense of humor in those days could not be taken away, and most importantly, the reputation allowed such jokes. The Frozen Throne became such a polished version of Warcraft that it was already difficult to come up with anything new. Blizzard still continues to support the add-on, and even in 2018, integrated widescreen support into the game. But this is not the most interesting thing. Warcraft 3 itself contained a map editor, world editor, thanks to which a lot of unofficial maps from the community appeared on the network. There, the gameplay could completely differ from the usual one. With the help of World Editor, you could change the characteristics of any unit, building, or spell. Even the characters' lines could be changed. This led to players creating their own cutscenes and weather effects. There were even amateur cinematics created using World Editor.
Behold the power of a goddess! Ikuzo! Sandalphon!
Anime? No anime. World Editor was most affected by maps. The Warcraft players' flight of imagination was unstoppable. It was with this help of the editor that the first independent game project, Defense of the Ancients, or Dota for short, was created, which inspired the foundations of a new genre. Perhaps most of all, this genre is known for the game Dota 2. The mapmaker of Dota was Kyle Sommer under the nickname Yule. It was thanks to him that a separate genre of MOBA games was born. Now everyone from young to old is pouring their money and free time into Dota 2. But that's not what we're talking about. Back to Blizzard. Despite another critical success of Warcraft 3, immediately after the release of the game, the first changes in the company's body began. In 2003, the main ideological leader, and in general the one who created Blizzard, Alain Adam, left his post. He explained his decision by saying that paperwork took up a lot of his time and he wanted to make games. The new CEO of the company became Michael Morheim, one of the first developers, who was also one of the founders of the company. Alain also took the position of the game consultant. Perhaps you've already thought that it was from this moment that the total crisis of Blizzard began. Not at all. It just loomed on the horizon. For a long time, Blizzard's gold mine remained its own multiplayer network, Battle.net. Blizzard was a de facto monopolist of online gaming. After all, thanks to the Battle.net, hundreds of thousands of players could safely play online and not think about a bad server connection or other problems. That's why Blizzard's directors, and especially Chris Metzen, thought, why not use Blizzard's multiplayer to the fullest? After all, the developers had the rudiments and desire to make their own MMORPG back in the period of creating Warcraft 3. It was in those years that the MMORPG genre began to gain momentum very actively thanks to the same EverQuest, Ultima Online, or Lineage 2. It was these games that now captivated players. So Blizzard quickly realized that this was their chance. Moreover, having a reputation as a studio where every game was a masterpiece, Blizzard could not afford that some EverQuest was better than them and took away the audience from them. World of Warcraft was released in 2004 and almost immediately crashed the company's servers, breaking Blizzard's pessimistic expectations about their own product. The fact was that the developers expected to see a maximum of 400,000 active players at the start of the project, and for them, this figure was already an incredible success. Despite the fact that Blizzard already had a lot of experience in game development, World of Warcraft was their first project in the MMORPG genre. Therefore, according to their own calculations that the game will not be very interesting at the start, they made servers for only 600,000 users.
I have never been so wrong in all my life.
But on the day of the launch, 3.5 million users visited the WoW servers. By the end of the week, this figure turned into 4 million, and a month later, into a full 5 million unique players. It was then that the developers realized that they needed some normal algorithm to create a queue. After all, such a simultaneous online game was simply impossible to play. A little more than 3 weeks later, Blizzard made a normal queue and urgently created additional servers. Up to this point, any attempts to enter the game led to an inevitable disconnect. Only a few players managed to see the magical world of Warcraft firsthand. Until the very day of the launch of WoW, no one could have imagined how beautiful and interesting a fantasy setting Blizzard could make in the open world of Azeroth. We'll tell you more about the features of the first WoW and all subsequent add-ons another time. After all, there are a lot of them. A demo version of WoW even deserves a separate video. And now it's enough to recall that the game was an incredible success, and mainly because of this, the studio was trapped in fan expectations, and instead of continuing their experiments, Blizzard began to invest all its resources in this cash cow. You probably know what this will lead to. For such a great success of WoW, Blizzard had to sacrifice something. It was the release of World of Warcraft that ruined many other projects of the company. The fact was that the development of WoW required large production capacities, time, and money, which were simply not enough for other products. A striking example of a game that, because of this, did not reach the release can be called Starcraft Ghost, which was supposed to be the first shooter of the company, and even based on the Starcraft universe with Nova in the title role. In fact, there were many more such games, and their development always occurred during periods when the company was developing one of its key franchises. After the launch of World of Warcraft, the company's community not only grew, but actually grew exponentially and reached the figure of 14 million active users. The profit that the company received also increased proportionately. And this was fabulous money, considering that from the very beginning you had to buy WoW and then pay for a monthly subscription at a price of $15. Therefore, with such outstanding financial capabilities, Blizzard became the first game studio to open its own annual exhibition of games, BlizzCon. The first BlizzCon was held in October 2005, and since then all conventions have been held at Anaheim Convention Center in Anaheim, California, in the same metropolitan area as Blizzard's headquarters in Irvine. Since then, Blizzard has hosted announcements related to Blizzard games, previews of upcoming games and related content, Q&A sessions with developers, and a cosplay contest from fans. And at the first closing ceremony, concerts of The Offspring, Tenacious D, Foo Fighters, Ozzy Osbourne, Blink-182, Metallica, Linkin Park, Weird Al Yankovic, and Muse were held in general. After all, Blizzard was fans of the rock genre. This is what, for example, the rock band in which the Blizzard developers themselves played looked like, and which gave concerts directly in the game. It was in 2005 that WoW's add-on was announced at BlizzCon, which became a key one in the company's history. It all determined the next 10 years of the game's quality standard. It was World of Warcraft: The Burning Crusade. Participants of the festival were given the opportunity to try out one of the new two game races, the Blood Elves and the Draenei, and were allowed to run around a new continent, or rather, it was not exactly a continent, but flying islands in the abyss, which were called Outland. The new add-on was not just high-quality work on errors, but also a full-fledged work that gave players access to a huge layer of history and storylines, as well as dozens of new features. Burning Crusade is the same version of the game that was able to set an extremely high bar in the MMORPG genre. It showed other companies exactly what a product should look like in this genre. At the same time, it's the final product of the company, which was worked on exclusively by old-school employees. However, it was Burning Crusade that was the quintessence of Blizzard's creativity. It was not surprising that under such conditions, it was considered the best add-on to the game in the entire history of World of Warcraft. This add-on showed that developers can not only create new content, but also put existing ones in order. But developers pleased their fans not only with WoW. On May 17, 2007, the presentation of Starcraft 2, which took place at the Olympic Gymnastics Arena in Seoul in front of tens of thousands of spectators. During the presentation, updated 3D graphics, improved mechanics, and an updated and expanded lore of the game were shown, which was a little lacking in the first part. In July the same year, news broke that Blizzard was working on a project called Hydra, which in fact will become Diablo 3 in the future. The last and main announcement at the presentation in Seoul was the third add-on for World of Warcraft: Wrath of the Lich King. These were Blizzard's golden times. They were essentially basking in fame, and it wasn't surprising. It was the studio which almost every year released games that were not just a wonderful product, but without exaggeration, masterpieces. Blizzard independently created the history of the gaming industry, a studio that has become one of the leaders in the genre of RTS and MMORPG, but now, despite the success, it was already felt somewhere in the air as if these were the last such years in the history of Blizzard. They reached their top of Mount Everest, and now they will gradually begin to roll down. And before we move on to the next part of this video, where we'll witness the tragic fall of Blizzard, we remind you that you can subscribe to our channel and support the release of new videos with your activity. Your likes and comments promote our videos to the top of YouTube and speed up the release of new videos. So if you like what we do, we advise you to subscribe so as to not miss new videos. And we continue. Troubles were coming at the company from where no one expected them. Soon, the Blizzards began to be accused by fans of all the deadly sins. However, it should be recalled that after Silicon and Synapse became Blizzard, the company was never an independent studio again. Initially, it was owned by Davidson and Associates, with which it had a great relationship because the developers had absolute freedom of action. The next owner was Vivendi. Despite the fact that now Vivendi no longer plays any role in the development of Blizzard, it used to be incredibly influential. It was the most powerful French media conglomerate, which bought up a huge amount of media products, whether movies and book publishing, television and telecommunications, video hosting, or even game studios. It was a certain Galactus, a character in the Marvel Universe, absorbing worlds who thus siphoned off significant amounts of money from companies, investing almost nothing in them. Vivendi's influence on Blizzard has been very mixed, but the bottom line is that Vivendi's investment was very small. In fact, they bought poor studios, gave some pennies and helped with the publication of games, and then just let the companies take their course, demanding a percentage of their profits from them. Vivendi didn't interfere much with the development process because they didn't understand anything about it. Moreover, Blizzard was already a reputable studio and they almost could be allowed to make their own decisions. Thanks to this, WoW, Diablo 2, and the potential Starcraft 2 appeared. But the main thing here is the word almost, because Vivendi's main desire was to make money, so they insisted that Blizzard actually milk their successful franchises. This, for example, affected the development of Diablo. After all, since 2000, Blizzard North was gradually falling apart. It was due to the fact that the company's core funds were focused on WoW and the idea of a new Diablo 3, which was supposed to be a mixture of action RPGs and MMOs. This did not suit Vivendi. It wanted a simple continuation of the already well-known Diablo. Because of this, in 2005, after a long quarrel with Vivendi, Blizzard North had to disband the unit. In this regard, another add-on to Diablo 2 was not released, and as a result, the concept of the future Diablo 3 has changed a lot, which we'll talk about a little later. But it was in the period from 2007 that the gaming industry began to develop madly. In order to remain market leaders and earn even more money, Vivendi announced a merger with Activision, which was approved by shareholders. The merger procedure itself was delayed until July 2008, as a result of which the company with the loud name Activision Blizzard was born. But the main problem was that as a result of this merger, the name Blizzard in the new company was supposedly just for beauty. After all, Bobby Kotick became the new director of Activision Blizzard. Remember this face, because this person will be one of the main reasons for the collapse of Blizzard. Bobby Kotick was the CEO of Activision at the time and was able to lead the company to financial success by buying it out of past owners for a few pennies. As a director, Bobby Kotick was an experienced person, because before that he was a director of Yahoo. He'll later serve on several boards of directors, including Coca-Cola since 2012 and Call of Duty Endowment, which he co-founded in 2009. But it was Bobby who wanted to get money from the WoW game, which brought the company $1.1 billion in profit a year just by paying for a subscription. And another interesting fact, in the same 2007, there was an incident involving Bobby's private jet and one flight attendant. The woman filed a lawsuit against Kotick and the company Cove Management, which was created to operate a private jet. She claimed that Kotick had treated her indecently, inciting her to unwanted intimacy, and that she was illegally fired after she reported the incident. In the end, Kotick denied all charges, and Cove Management tried to hush up the incident and somehow negotiate with the flight attendant. After that, Kotick began to participate in the trial, and the court ruled in favor of the company. You just saw a short sketch of a portrait of a man who has now taken an even more comfortable chair as the head of Activision Blizzard. Ironically, in the early years after the merger, Blizzard continued to do what it liked and did best. The combined companies worked in a kind of symbiosis. Activision showed Blizzard a lot of financial and marketing life hacks, and in addition, Activision had its own studio for the production of high-quality cinematics. Blizzard released add-ons to the iconic World of Warcraft, held the annual BlizzCon festival. Everything was fine. Allegedly, initially the philosophy of Activision Blizzard management was not to interfere in the development of Blizzard games. After all, Blizzard already succeeded. Only part of the profit from its own products now had to be given to Activision. In some ways, Activision helped keep Blizzard in this frenzied market afloat that changed and evolved at the speed of light. Activision knew how to sell their product, which Blizzard did poorly. They always succeeded thanks to their professionalism, the quality of games, and the trust of fans. It was then during these reformations that World of Warcraft Wrath of the Lich King, known to many fans, was released. The formation of Activision Blizzard affected the most important aspect in the framework of World of Warcraft. Associated with the add-on to Warcraft 3 The Frozen Throne, it was a really cool game, with one of the most exciting and tragic stories in the history of World of Warcraft.
Father, is it over?
At long last. No king rules forever, my son.
I see. Only darkness before me.
After that, one old fag started crying somewhere. Like it if it's you. The release of World of Warcraft Wrath of the Lich King came at a time when the world of the game industry began to change in a direction that can be observed now. From 2008 to 2013, esports entered the global arena. And do not forget who helped this. It's clear that esports appeared not only thanks to Blizzard. Back in the 90s, John Romero and id Software, inspired by Street Fighter II and Fatal Fury, added a deathmatch mode to the just-released Doom. And it was in Doom that one of the first online tournaments was held, without any stadiums, millions of prize money, and costume shows.
Oh, sitting next to Bendy.
You wish it were Bendy.
Isn't it?
Already in the late 1990s, the Cyber Athlete Professional League Tournament Organization and the annual QuakeCon Congress appeared. It was in the Cyber Athlete Professional League that Counter-Strike, Quake, and the already mentioned Starcraft and Warcraft tournaments were held. Blizzard at that time was the only company that created two unique, balanced, and optimized games in the RTS genre, which were used for online tournaments. Thus, Starcraft and Warcraft gained an even more popularity and consistently brought profit to Blizzard. In addition, Blizzard projects, unlike Counter-Strike and Quake, have already managed to capture the Eastern market. The 2000s were the peak of the popularity of television esports in South Korea. There, it was real almost at the state level. There were esports schools and camps. Instead of football, young people sat in the evenings and watched the fights of Zerg and Terrans. It sounds fantastic, but it's true. All matches were then regularly broadcast by specialized round-the-clock cable gaming channels, OnGameNet and NBC Game. In April 2006, 7 well-known Counter-Strike teams, 4Kings, Fnatic, Made in Brazil, Mouse Sports, NIP, SK Gaming, Team 3D, founded the G7 Team Federation. Not the G7 you might think of. Its main tasks were to promote esports, improve interaction with the esports society, and cooperate with leagues and tournaments. Thus, in the 2010s, the field of esports grew significantly, providing a significant increase in both the audience and cash prizes. Esports is becoming prestigious not only in Korea, but also around the world. The scale and number of tournaments grew significantly, increasing from 10 tournaments in 2000 to about 260 in 2010. During this period, many successful tournaments were founded, including the well-known World Cyber Games, Intel Extreme Masters, and Major League Gaming. In addition, since 2012, the world has begun to capture the MOBA genre.
A tournament of $1.6 million, that's the future of gaming. This is awesome.
Riot Games has released League of Legends, and Gabe Newell introduces Dota 2 to the world. So now the map for Warcraft 3 called Dota, created by an ordinary player under the nickname Yule, has become a full-fledged game. The company, Valve, inviting Yule and his colleague IceFrog to work on the new game, made a real work of art in the MOBA genre, a game that began to catch up and bypass the Blizzard games in popularity. Since 2012, every self-respecting 7th grader becomes an esports player. He asks his mother for funds for a professional mouse, headphones, and a mouse pad to cover the entire table. Yeah, during this period, gaming companies began to boom for an audience of 12 to 16 years old, which previously did not go beyond single-player or cooperative games with friends, and now got a free opportunity to play something multiplayer and very popular. The icing on the cake of esports success is the emergence of online streaming services like Twitch. The platform was launched in 2011 and gave millions of fans the opportunity to watch esports tournaments online. What games do you think were in the top views? Of course, League of Legends and Dota 2. Against the background of these tectonic changes in the industry, Blizzard began to gradually bring up the rear. After all, the company invested the main potential of its work in WoW, abandoning the development of Diablo and Starcraft, which were announced back in 2007, until 2012. No one fully knew their fate. So Bobby Kotick, who was very fond of the rustle of money in his wallet, decided to immediately launch the production of StarCraft 2 with the idea of splitting StarCraft 2 into 3 separate campaigns to earn as much money as possible. In fact, it was still half the trouble. The first problem was the delay of the game. The release of the StarCraft 2 beta test was planned for 2009, but the developers did not have time to adequately finish the game, which is why it happened in 2010. But after this beta of the project, it became known that the game, over a local network in StarCraft 2, simply will not be. And then Blizzard said that there would be no inter-server game either. That is, for example, players from Korea will not be able to play with Americans, which was possible in the first StarCraft. This raised a loud wave of indignation, and thank God that Blizzard has always listened to the community and lifted restrictions on inter-server play. They even integrated Facebook into the Battle.net so that players can find friends around the world and play with them. The first part of the StarCraft 2 trilogy hit the market on July 27, 2010, and Blizzard immediately faced the second most significant challenge. At the release, the game received significantly less attention in Korea compared to the first part, and the country's esports leagues generally ignored the release of the sequel. At the same time, the Eastern market, for a second, was the biggest connoisseur of StarCraft. The problem was that the Koreans were completely satisfied with the first part of the game, and they didn't want to hear about any second StarCraft. As a result, Blizzard did not find a better way out than to sue a number of TV channels as well as esports Korean leagues under the article on copyright infringement. The courts were rather demonstrative and did not aim to achieve a real penalty. However, the desired effect was achieved, and soon Korea slowly and very reluctantly began to switch to StarCraft 2. However, no matter how hard Blizzard tried, the first part still remains more popular in Korea than the second. So there was the first incident in the history of Blizzard when the target of lawsuits was not pirates or other violators, but people who developed their own products. Be that as it may, StarCraft 2 was really a very good game. The developers fueled interest into the game even at the announcement, and despite a strong decline in interest in real-time strategy games, Blizzard has managed to regain interest in the genre of players. This was achieved due to the record budget that was allocated for the game. All the money was not spent in vain. There were new, cool graphics, incredible cinematics that appeared with the help of Activision. Of course, there were some problems in the balance sheet, but in general, the international community quickly adopted the new product. The company's shares began to rise rapidly in price, and Blizzard's audience once again increased. Interestingly, StarCraft 2 Wings of Liberty was only the first part of several parts announced by the developers. Each part focuses on one of the 3 game races, and together they should form a full-fledged story. The first part of the trilogy was devoted to Zerg. Already in March 2013, the developers released the first add-on for the game, StarCraft 2 Heart of the Swarm. It continued the story of the Zerg and told about the desire of the Queen of Blades, Sarah Kerrigan, to take revenge on the Emperor of the Terran Dominion. And in November 2015, the final part of the trilogy, StarCraft 2 Legacy of the Void, was released. It focused on the Protoss race. A year later, the developers released another add-on to the single-player campaign Nova Covert Ops, but we'd talk about all this another time in a separate video. In general, in those days, Blizzard apparently guided the principle, add-ons are never too many, and in 2010, the company released the 4th add-on for World of Warcraft, Cataclysm. The add-on has preserved the traditions of past versions, new raids, new items, and an even greater disregard for damage. But probably the only and key thing that distinguished this add-on from the previous ones was the plot. For the first time, Blizzard moved away from the main storyline and made it so that one dragon, Deathwing the Destroyer, was to blame for everything, while the Lich King developed the whole drama of the peoples of Azeroth. In fact, this was not a big disadvantage. The add-on's good sales, 12.5 million active subscribers, unfortunately lasted only the first few months, and just when everything should have been fine, after the Cataclysm comes a turning point in the history of Blizzard. Some very symbolic add-on came out. Since 2011, online has dropped to 8 million and started to gradually decrease. But oddly enough, it wasn't Blizzard's fault. As we said a little earlier, 2011 was the heyday of esports in the MOBA game genre. Therefore, Blizzard and its WoW did not pass face control in modern times. First of all, you need to understand that at this very time, the world came out of a prolonged economic crisis. So now, players had less time to sit in front of the monitor all day and conquer raids. The so-called fast food games trend has begun. You can quickly play in it, have fun, and turn it off. And Blizzard didn't have such a game. In addition, the company's success was also affected by the growth in the number of competitors. After all, Blizzard has ceased to be leaders in the MMORPG world. The same rift deprived Blizzard of almost 500,000 active subscribers, and Guild Wars 2 even took about 1 million users. Blizzard began to realize that a large number of players were gradually losing interest in their product, although the quality of games did not disappear anywhere. After all the old fags, as part of the developers, worked fruitfully in their places. The determining factor for everyone will be the decisions that the company will make during this crisis. At some point, the drop in revenue began to affect Blizzard more than before, so the idea for the rescue was to revive Diablo, which made the company name it 10 years ago. Why the revival? Because the development of Diablo 3 went into production hell. During the collapse of Blizzard North, the remaining employees of the company were unable to release the third part, and all the screenshots that appeared on the internet at that time infuriated and horrified fans, because the game was very raw. The result of the development was quite deplorable. Blizzard North merged with Blizzard's main office, and thus disbanded a separate division. The creation of Diablo 3 fell into the hands of people who worked on World of Warcraft but never encountered dark fantasy. As a result, the game, which was supposed to appear on the shelves back in 2005, appeared on the market almost 7 years later, on May 15, 2012. However, what happened with Diablo 3 was a unique phenomenon. In the beginning, Diablo 3 was something absolutely terrible from all sides. Since the game required an internet connection, due to errors and lags, players could not play at all on the release. For almost a month, players could not properly connect to the game as the server simply crashed. And this was already 2012 and not 2004 when the first part of WoW was released. It all got to the point that Blizzard started returning users money for the game. And in this situation, they could not but be praised, because Blizzard became the first company in history to do this. The gameplay in Diablo 3 was also not very good. An innovation was the auction, an in-game store. There they sold not some skins or cute animals for players, but quite useful equipment that could be used to kill mobs productively. You could do this both for regular in-game currency and for very real money. Today, of course, this can hardly surprise anyone. The main problem of the store was that the game items that were sold had the same chance of dropping from everything, both from the mob and from the box or jug, and there was absolutely no point in killing bosses in Diablo 3. The game turned into a grind. In addition, many people were concerned that the game became very bright compared to the previous parts of Diablo. Perhaps this was due to the fact that people from WoW worked on the game, or perhaps not. Be that as it may, as a result, due to countless patches and changes, Blizzard still removed the auction, leveled the probability of drops, and made all the mechanics in the game adequate. And Diablo 3 became really beautiful. But it was a completely different story, so if you're interested in finding out exactly how Diablo 3 changed, what was done well in it, and in general everything about the Diablo franchise, write to us about it in the comments and we will definitely devote a separate video to it. Purely due to its former reputation, the game sold an excellent circulation of 3.5 million copies, but this did not save Blizzard from the crisis. Since 2012, Activision has been actively interfering in Blizzard's affairs. The lifeline for the company was supposed to be the release of the 5th add-on to WoW, World of Warcraft Mists of Pandaria. In fact, WoW was the main franchise of the company that brought it money. So now Blizzard planned to take over the entire Eastern market with the game, emulating the success of Starcraft. World of Warcraft Mists of Pandaria was released in 2012. The setting of the Blizzard's add-on is based on Eastern culture and traditions. It was then that the Monk class appeared in the game. There was a new race of Pandarans, and with it, respectively, a new continent, Pandaria. It seems that the plan was good, and the results of the project were quite adequate. But in the first year after its release, the number of active subscribers to the game fell to 8 million and then to 7 million accounts. As it turned out, the game's setting did not work for the Eastern audience, but on the contrary for the Western one. After all, the Eastern market was not interested in setting, which they were already fed up with from a local manufacturer. In addition, Blizzard began to lose its Eastern audience in Starcraft. Only old players remained in the game and the influx of new players stopped. For them, the game was completely uninteresting and looked quite archaic. So the company didn't come up with anything better than monetizing Starcraft like World of Warcraft by creating a subscription system for the game. It was a fatal mistake. The game lasted only a few months, and soon Blizzard was made to provide free access to StarCraft 2 to everyone who purchased it. Only access to the campaign continued to require payment. Thus, a situation arose in which Blizzard began to have unprofitable franchises. The WoW, in which Blizzard invested all its strength and resources, began to lose money, and StarCraft 2 and Diablo 3 also began to die. The first one brought Blizzard profit only thanks to the acquisition of the campaign, but at the same time it pulled back hundreds of thousands of dollars to support servers and host tournaments. And Diablo, after a relative success, began to lose players due to the fact that they usually deleted it after completing the game. So, to take matters in its own hand, Activision Blizzard was preparing to acquire its shares in French conglomerate Vivendi in mid-summer 2013.
Never be slaves!
Thus, Blizzard had to gain independence from the owner who pulled them to the bottom. Until 2013, Vivendi held controlling shares of 52%. Therefore, with huge losses from Blizzard's projects, Vivendi was ready to sell all its shares at a price of $13.06 apiece. As a result, only 12% or 83 million shares remained in its hands. 429 million were bought by Activision Blizzard. 172 million were bought personally by Bobby Kotick, the new chairman of the board, Brian Kelly, as well as the Chinese holding company Tencent. This deal completely stripped Vivendi of its influence on Blizzard. But after becoming a little freer, Blizzard was still under the leadership of Bobby Kotick. So, after getting some fresh air, Blizzard started developing new projects. The company's first new game was Hearthstone, released in 2014, and it was a good comeback on the part of the company. It followed a path it knew well. The developers chose a genre that was not popular in those days for the game, then took the entire brilliant WoW setting and invested as much possible in the artistic component. As a result, it turned out to be one of the best free collectible online card games, which actually popularized the genre among the mass audience. A few years later, the authors of games such as The Witcher and Dota 2 realized that they also needed their own card analogs. And if this was a logical development on the part of competing companies, then the next idea that was born in Blizzard's office was, to put it mildly, strange. It decided to create its own game in the MOBA genre. And soon Blizzard started working on the game Blizzard Dota.
It's time to stop! It's time to stop, okay?
Yeah, Blizzard Dota. You're not heard. It's not clear how the company could not have heard that Dota 2 already existed and had belonged to Gabe Newell, and it was made by Yule and the legendary Ice Frog, which no one has ever seen, the authors of the first versions of Dota for Warcraft. It's funny, but most of the characters, artifacts, and skills that belong to Blizzard, Gabe kindly borrowed for Dota 2. As they say, first come, first served. But Blizzard did not want to give up, so they're filing a lawsuit against Valve in which the main claim is that Dota is the name of the Defense of the Ancients trademark, which, like the characters, belongs to Blizzard. However, lawyers from Valve took care of the trademark earlier, changed the name, and registered Dota not as an abbreviation, but as an ordinary word. Therefore, in 2012, Blizzard lost a lawsuit against Valve. In addition, Dota is a mod created by Yule, and the copyright was assigned to him. Blizzard had no choice but to come up with a new concept for the upcoming game. Thus, the development of Heroes of the Storm began, and while it was being developed, Blizzard watched with tears in their eyes as their competitors who borrowed their mechanics earned hundreds of millions of dollars and held tournaments watched by millions of people. Heroes of the Storm released in 2015. The game was really different from Dota and League of Legends. Blizzard didn't think long and used the characters of all their key franchises as characters in a conditional limbo called Nexus, where they competed. Even the Lost Vikings were not forgotten. But in fact, Blizzard adopted the experience of Riot and League of Legends with a variety of game map systems and the purchase of heroes in the game.
We'll show them. We will show them all. I want you to lose like
In Heroes of the Storm, there were 3 in-game currencies. One of them was used to buy heroes, another for skins, and the third was a donation currency for which players could buy everything. Now it looks very sad, but at that time, loyal fans of the company adopted the game, and in the beginning they liked it. Of course, the game could not compete with such titans as Dota and LoL, but Heroes of the Storm had their own tournaments and the community itself. But when you played HOTS, you couldn't get rid of the feeling that you were playing a product that you hadn't bothered with for a long time, as if it was just needed to prove that Blizzard can also hold esports tournaments and build stadiums. We'll talk about this later. The third and final novelty of Blizzard was supposed to be a new MMO bestseller in the Starcraft setting. The first rumors about MMOs with Terrans, Zergs, and Protoss appeared back in 2008. But in the end, the company changed its mind due to the fact that Starcraft was rapidly losing its popularity. Then the team decided to create MMO in a sci-fi setting from scratch under the working name of the Project Titan. Blizzard has selected a team of several hundred people to create the game. Development lasted about 5 years, and in 2013, it was curtailed. The management surprisingly changed its mind. Instead, Blizzard decided to use their best practices for Titan to conquer the genre of competitive shooters. Thus, Overwatch appeared in 2016. Blizzard's game was able to surpass the biggest competitor at that time, Team Fortress 2, thereby having a rematch with Gabe and answering for Dota. So yes, the game was really successful, had a bunch of cool unique gameplay mechanics in a seemingly ordinary shooter. In Overwatch, everything was at the highest level, the dynamics of battles, graphics, and most importantly, very attractive character models.
I see you don't have a lifeguard here at your beach.
I'm not at the beach, this is a bathtub.
People really wanted to play for the characters. These aren't sweaty men from Team Fortress. Therefore, the game got back the company on its feet and was able to return Blizzard to the world stage. And most importantly, most of the players have lost the feeling that Blizzard has some problems. Everyone just played the company's new games and had fun. At this point, let's go back a little to 2006. When Blizzard's business was going up, they decided to make a full-fledged film about it. At that time, the most successful game universe, Warcraft. The company announced its plans, and this request was immediately responded to by Universal Pictures. That time, it actively competed with Warner Bros., which already had very successful film adaptations of the Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings franchises. The idea of creating the first large-scale fantasy film based on the video game universe seemed like a good prospect. There's much more material for films in the Warcraft universe than the same Harry Potter or the Lord of the Rings. Blizzard agreed to cooperate with Universal because the developers did not have to spend their own money on creating the film, but only grant the rights. However, Blizzard was extremely important that the film did not spoil the successful game franchise. Because of this, Blizzard insisted on responsible casting of the team that will work on the film. One of the main writers was Chris Metzen himself, who was the ideological leader and screenwriter for the first 3 main Blizzard franchises, Warcraft, Starcraft, and Diablo. And the first appointed director of the film was Sam Raimi, who was already known for his work on the first and second part of Spider-Man. But he was soon replaced by Duncan Jones, the son of British musician and actor David Bowie. Duncan had previously directed the sci-fi film Moon and the commercially successful sci-fi action film Source Code, but this did not help the future film to achieve success in any way. Perhaps the problem was that the film fell into production hell. Work on it began in 2007 and the film itself was supposed to be released in 2009, but it was cancelled due to the fact that the scenes and an idea were very similar to the first Lord of the Rings. Then in 2011, at Comic-Con, it was announced that the film was still in development, and in 2013 there was a change of director. Thus, the film Warcraft hit the screens only on May 24, 2016, when there was, by and large, decline of interest in Warcraft itself. The plot of the film is based on the story of the first part of Warcraft. To be honest, in terms of plot, the movie was bad. So it corresponded to the plot of the game and showed famous characters, but it was illogical, ragged, and tried to tell as much as possible in a short time frame. Fans expected to see something on the big screen that they'd not seen yet in the same Warcraft or WoW. Given that the studio is famous for its cool cinematics, something very cool was supposed to be released on the screens of cinemas, but that didn't happen. The film turned out to be mediocre. The film has an average score of 4.4 out of 10 on Rotten Tomatoes, and the main criticism was, quote, Warcraft has visual thrills to spare, but they, and director Duncan Jones' distinctive gifts, are wasted on a sluggish and derivative adaptation of a best-selling game with little evident cinematic value.
I see you and your men have survived. Perhaps Black Hand kept you safely away from the battlefield?
Therefore, after the movie, no one ran to buy a subscription to the new WoW add-on, which at that time was World of Warcraft Legion. By the way, fans also expected something incredible from it. The developers again promised to add a bunch of new mechanics and plot, and soon the developers came out with a statement that this add-on was sold out in the largest circulation in history, but Blizzard deceived everyone, naming sales figures for the first week. The rest of the time on Legion was indifferent to everyone, to both the old fans and new players, and even just streamers. Due to the problems of the main Blizzard franchise, a lot of so-called vanilla WoW servers began to appear in the world. For example, among them was Nostalrius, one of the first largest private servers with an early-stage game that fans nicknamed Vanilla. The peculiarity of this version is that it did not have any add-ons, and since the new add-ons to the WoW after Lich King did not meet the expectations of players, and the game itself ceased to cause them pleasure due to excessive causality, the return to the classic WoW was a fresh breath. In just 1 year of its operation, the Nostalrius project had more than 800,000 registered accounts. A huge share of the WoW fanbase moved from official servers to pirated ones. Therefore, Blizzard, realizing that the company has begun to receive even less money, decided to find out what the reason was. Paying attention to the problem and the Nostalrius project, Blizzard began a legal fight, and obviously, their lawsuits against the developers of pirated servers were successful. Servers shut down, but despite this victory, all the same concerned players who believe that Blizzard has been ignoring them for the past 10 years began to show more and more dissatisfaction. It became impossible to ignore the requests and desires of fans to return the classic WoW. To prevent the appearance of even more pirated Warcraft servers, Blizzard decided to create WoW Classic. However, this will take another 5 years, and during this period, the company will have its worst times. And it's all the fault of the scandals associated with the leadership of the former titan of the gaming industry, which like a snowball reached its critical mass in recent years. Remember when we first introduced Bobby Kotick in this video, we mentioned a long-standing sex scandal involving him. When Bobby couldn't keep his temper in his pants in 2007, the situation stalled. So, a similar pattern of behavior and ideology of Bobby began to take root within the company. A vivid example is BlizzCon in 2013. At the end of the official event, the developers went to celebrate in a closed format. After the corporate event, one of the developers, Alex Afrasiabi, who was senior creative director of World of Warcraft, uploaded a photo to Facebook showing that a large photo of Bill Cosby was brought to this party. Cosby is an American comedian, actor, and television producer who in the 10th years was involved in a case of sex without mutual consent and was sentenced to a prison term of 3 to 10 years. So soon there was a collective correspondence from the corporate event where Alex Afrasiabi, Hearthstone's chief designer Dave Kosak, and Game's lead designer Corey Stockton had a dialogue about inviting women to a Bill Cosby party. Later in 2017, at another party, Blizzard employees distributed obscene photos of a finance employee, Carrie Moynihan. A year later, Carrie's body was found in a hotel room. She decided to pass away during an Activision Blizzard event at Disneyland. The parents of a 32-year-old woman filed a lawsuit against supervisor Alex Afrasiabi, the same one who had fun with the portrait of Bill Cosby. They claimed that Afrasiabi wanted to persuade her to have intimacy that she didn't want. Blizzard immediately responded to the lawsuit, saying in a public comment that the allegations were false in some places. The case was put on pause due to a lack of evidence. But Activision Blizzard director Bobby Kotick said he would fire all those charged and eliminate the toxic culture. Well, except for himself, of course. On July 20th, 2021, the California Department of Employment and Housing filed a lawsuit against Activision Blizzard for employee discrimination. The lawsuit spread online, and 8 days later in Irvine, California, hundreds of Blizzard employees went on strike near the main office of Activision Blizzard. This event was the result of harassment lawsuits against Carrie Moynihan. The management tried to hush up all the charges, but the Wall Street Journal took up the case. As a result of the investigation of the publication, it turned out that Kotick knew about the harassment for several years but hid it from the board of directors. Of course, after the scandal on July 20th, Kotick did not care about the implementation of his statement, but first of all about eliminating the damage that was caused to the company's reputation. It soon turned out that the flight attendant from 2007 who accused Bobby Kotick of wanting to persuade her to have sex without mutual consent was still right. After the incident, Bobby recorded her voice messages with threats to harm her.
Oh, hi, Classy. Listen, do you have a wallet or a purse?
I have a purse.
Oh, baby. I want you to take the money out and count it really slowly.
Okay. 1.
Ooh, that's nice.
2.
Oh, my.
I'm sorry, the next bill I have in here is a 10.
Oh, I love you. All that and everything.
She recanted her accusations, so the case was decided in favor of Kotick. In addition to the flight attendant, he threatened several other employees of his company. Activision confirmed that there was such an incident. On November 17, 2021, Activision Blizzard shareholders published an open letter demanding the resignation of Bobby Kotick, and more than 100 Blizzard employees again went on strike near Blizzard's main office. This time, the strike was dedicated to the resignation of Bobby Kotick, who already had a lot of questions from investors. In addition to Kotick's resignation, the purpose of the protest was to launch an investigation into 9 other victims of CEO Bobby Kotick's harassment and hold the company accountable for promoting a toxic culture. After all, in Activision Blizzard at that time, the ideology of paying women a lower salary than men flourished, as well as appointing women to lower-level positions. In short, the CEO of Activision should have been fired for ignoring numerous complaints about the company's toxic work culture. And you know what? After all the lawsuits, Kotick will remain with the company until December 29, 2023. The court lacked numerous pieces of evidence and statements. Probably the fact is that Bobby Kotick is the most successful manager in the gaming industry today. During his leadership, the capitalization of Activision Blizzard has grown to $70 billion since the merger of the companies. Why did he work there until December 29, 2023? The fact is that in January 2022, when Blizzard's shares fell through the floor and the games that the company released stopped saving it, Microsoft joined in the situation. Microsoft decided to buy out Activision Blizzard for $69.7 billion, which was a record for the entire gaming industry. For a second, this was $3 billion more than Lithuania's budget for 2021. We can say that Microsoft went the way of Disney, absorbing other game companies. They already controlled Xbox and took over the ZeniMax Media holding, which included Bethesda and id Software. Therefore, the possibility of acquiring Blizzard was only a matter of time for Microsoft. After a lengthy antitrust review and even an outright court injunction against acquiring Blizzard, Microsoft still won the process. The agreement was approved by the European Commission, and on May 15, 2023, Blizzard's assets became part of Microsoft. How this will affect the future of Blizzard and their projects, we can only guess. But most importantly, after signing the deal, Bobby Kotick left the company. This was the logical conclusion of the merger of Microsoft and Blizzard. Instead of Kotick, Matt Booty became the head of the company. Now, under his leadership, are Bethesda, Activision Blizzard, and Xbox Game Studios. Do you know what Bobby Kotick himself wrote in his farewell letter? I will always be profoundly grateful to the people who contributed tirelessly to building this company, and I am confident you will keep inspiring joy and uniting people through the power of play. The network was massively happy about the dismissal of the CEO of Activision Blizzard. Finally, the company's members could breathe a sigh of relief. Windows Central journalist Jez Corden wrote that none of the company's former or current employees have reacted positively to Kotick since, quote, "This man was hated, and apparently more than deserved. It was only one comment out of 50. Interestingly, while there were lawsuits with Kotick, Blizzard began to spoil their relations not only with the company. In addition to the shameful attitude towards employees, the company forgot about its fan community and actually destroyed its own projects. Due to the scandals with Kotick, the heads of all game development and development departments began to leave the company. In 2018, Michael Morheim himself left the post of director of Blizzard. J. Allen Brack took his place. Michael was followed by Frank Pierce in 2019. And the only one left on Blizzard's 3 founding team was Alain Adam, who returned to Blizzard in the same 2019. It's during the development of J. Allen Brack as director that inevitable things begin to happen with Blizzard games. On December 13th, 2018 at BlizzCon, J. Allen Brack and Blizzard's director of development, Ray Gretzko, jointly announced that the main developers of Hero of the Storm will move on to other projects, and the game will enter the long-term support phase. Blizzard also announced the cancellation of its Heroes Global Championship and Heroes of the Storm esports tournaments. That was for which the game was created, and members of the esports community around Heroes of the Storm said that they were caught off guard by this announcement and that recently at BlizzCon 2018, the developers promised them a continuation of the Heroes Global Championship. But that was just the beginning. In the same 2018, the company announced the Diablo Immortal project, the mobile version of Diablo 3. Instead of the long-awaited 4th part of the franchise. Of course, people started systematically boycotting everything related to Blizzard. Then, Blizzard's official Twitter account came under a barrage of a flurry of negativity from fans who demanded the cancellation of Immortal. And the worst thing that happened at BlizzCon that year was the Q&A.
I was curious, I see a lot of mechanics that we've kind of been begging for in Diablo 3 in this. Is there any plans to make this playable on PC, or is this strictly mobile forever?
Are there any? The current plan is to be on mobile, both Android and iOS. We don't have any plans at the moment to do PC. You guys not have phones?
Yeah, you guys all have phones, right?
You can play on your tablet too.
After hearing such an announcement, people began to leave the event, and the phrase from the main producer of the game, Wyatt Cheng, "Don't you have mobile phones?" just broke up the community. Trying to somehow improve the situation, Blizzard announced a remaster of the third part of Warcraft, but it drowns the company even more. Blizzard opened pre-sales along with the announcement and promised to launch the game by the end of 2019. As a result, the remaster was released late, only in January 2020, and became the lowest rated game in the history of the Metacritic site. Is just 0.6 points from users a good response from the community? The remaster had countless problems. There were a lot of bugs, broken textures, lack of previously announced cinematographic cinematics, and extended campaign missions. And the problem was that the game was not developed by Blizzard. They simply outsourced the representative of the cult franchise to the Malaysian studio Lemon Sky. They already treated the project as a pass-through. The project was also affected by the lack of funding. Activision doubted sales of the game and allocated a reduced budget for the remaster, the amount of which was not even specified. The fly in the ointment was supposed to be the restart of the WoW. In 2019, Blizzard opened a Classic WoW server. The community received the official Classic WoW, which was been waiting for a long time, and surprisingly it worked in the company's favor. Nostalgia was gradually bringing back old players, and the game has even started to attract new ones. However, how could it be without a problem? Now there were 3 game add-ons, from the Lich King to the Classics, that deserved decent ratings from players and critics. But due to the fact that the company stopped marketing altogether at the time of the add-on of WoW Burning Crusade, fans did not understand what was happening. In addition, the game suffered from scandals with Kotick, which was why players refused to play it, and the dismissal of developers affected the number of bugs and broken mechanics in the Classic. So Blizzard lost everything again.
Our journey begins with this mug.
Dave, lift the microphone.
Whoa!
By the way, in 2019, the announcement of Overwatch 2 took place. The main motivation for Blizzard to make the second part of the game, less than 3 years after the release of the already successful original, was the desire to transfer the game to free-to-play because it's more profitable than a one-time purchase of the game. The developers decided to make PvE in the game with a full-fledged story campaign, PvE missions for heroes in the form of separate events with loot, large maps, and the like. In fact, the developers wanted to make the same Titan project, which was never implemented. It's not a bad idea, but a big question: why? After all, for 3 years of existence, Overwatch itself began to have its hard times. With the addition of new characters, there were balance issues that Blizzard was in no hurry to fix, and then you have a second part of Overwatch. Already on the beta test in 2022, players complained about a completely raw game, and the most important thing was that the developers did not show the PvE mode. It was the same first part of Overwatch. The game was released on August 10th, 2023. Following current gaming trends, Blizzard came up with nothing better than adding a paid battle pass and placing a new game character at the very end of it, even considering that the game was focused on esports where there can be no pay-to-win ideology. The promised PvE content never appeared. The developers added only corporate quests. That's all. Overwatch turned from a very good shooter that could have flourished if Blizzard had allocated energy, money, and time to it into another of their failures. When Blizzard games started to fail, instead of listening to what players want and finding consensus between developers and consumers, the company's management decided to reduce its staff to 9,600 people. And this is a lot. Only Ubisoft and Electronic Arts have more. Despite the financial records that were set, among other things, thanks to these employees, Activision, led by Bobby Kotick, laid off 770 people. The dismissed employees told Yahoo and Kotaku news outlets that the decision was made by management without any discussion with them. In 2021, Blizzard's director J. Allen Brack also announced his dismissal shortly after the situation with discrimination and harassment with game studios escalated. From this point on, Blizzard starts a new game policy. The director's chair is occupied by a pair of Brack co-executives, Jen O'Neill, who left the post of head Vicarious Vision Studios, and Mike Ibarra, who stopped being vice president of Xbox. They actively support minority policies, and it was during their management that transgender characters appeared in Blizzard games, and any discrimination in the company began to be severely punished. In WoW, the fee for changing the gender of heroes was cancelled altogether. According to the authors, it was wrong to take real money for this. The changes also affected Overwatch, where they removed 2 explicit poses of characters, and the character of Soldier 76 was made a homosexual.
You're one of those heroes, aren't you?
Not anymore.
One of the latest games from Blizzard, which was released recently, was the long-awaited Diablo 4. It is not clear whom to thank that it did not become a game for smartphones. So, what did the players get after 10 years of waiting for the new part? What has already become a classic? It is a completely unsuitable game for passing with a bunch of bugs and freezes, even on a cool gaming computer. The plot component did not strengthen the achievements of the past parts in any way, but even so, the game was able to earn a lot of money and positive reviews from critics. Whether this was good or not, critics called Diablo 4, quote, Blizzard's most important and key game since World of Warcraft, which exceeds all expectations. Maybe they deliberately underestimated expectations so diligently from their games in order to be able to surprise their fans again, as before. Write what you think in the comments. Unfortunately, or fortunately, that's how we know Blizzard today. And that's how they opened BlizzCon 2023. There were a lot of bets on it due to the dismissal of Kotick and Blizzard's move to Microsoft. However, the developers announced a new character in Overwatch, the first add-on to Diablo 4, and WoW Classic Season of Discovery. It will be a new official add-on in which the developers decided to implement everything that they did not have time for since the very first WoW. But the star of BlizzCon was the main version of WoW, where Chris Metzen showed us as many as 3 new add-ons that will finally reveal to players the main storyline of the world, the story of the Titan Azeroth. In addition, viewers heard a lot of promises that updates will be released more often and work on them will be more fruitful. But even that wasn't the end of the Blizzard storm. It's been just over 3 months since the Activision Blizzard teams became part of Microsoft, and now the new management's putting things in order and customizing all the processes in the company for themselves, starting with personnel changes. 1,900 people were laid off from the total Microsoft gaming staff of 22,000 employees. Most of them were employees of Activision Blizzard. Against the background of this news, Blizzard chairman Mike Ibarra wrote a post of gratitude and announced that he was leaving the company. He worked at Microsoft for 20 years, and for the last 4 years served as president of Blizzard Entertainment. Along with Mike, one of its 3 founders, chief designer Alain Adam, left the company. By the way, he's leaving Blizzard for the 2nd time. Game journalist Jason Schreier, author of Blood, Sweat, and Pixels and Press Reset, finds this resignation strange and uncharacteristic for Ibarra. After all, even at BlizzCon 2023, in an interview with Schreier, Ibarra spoke about his plans to work in the company for a very long time. Therefore, the departure of Ibarra and Adams' team easily fits into the overall picture with the layoff of some employees. What will happen next with Blizzard Studios, perhaps God only knows. The new management has already canceled the development of the announced survival game from Blizzard. Some of the employees who worked on it were scattered to other projects at the company. And how many more such projects will be canceled? How many more Blizzard employees will be laid off? And should we even expect some bright future for the once majestic and beloved Blizzard Entertainment company? One day, we will get answers to these questions. In the meantime, today we can only believe that Blizzard will release many new high-quality projects. There will be a 3rd Starcraft, a 4th Warcraft, new Vikings, and the studio will again become #1 in the gaming industry. Yes, these are no longer the Blizzard we knew. Apparently, they will never become those ambitious rock and rollers in the world of the game industry, real geeks in their field. But when you love, you are ready to believe to the end. And Blizzard is exactly the studio that, despite all the troubles and snowstorms, you want to love. In the meantime, we all hope for a miracle that will come down to Blizzard. You can support the release of the next videos as soon as possible by subscribing to the channel and ringing the bell so as to not miss new videos. Be sure to like it, After all, this is the only way we can assess your interest in the topics that we raise. You can watch our other video that has just appeared on the screen. Thank you for watching this video to the end. It was PressX. See you soon.